Donc, merci beaucoup au dernier carré d'être là avec nous pour la troisième des trois conférences sur la justice climatique de Simon Caney. Many thanks for those of you who are with us for the third conference of Simon Caney on climate justice. So the title now is Political Responsibilities to Tackle Climate Change. Et comme tout à l'heure, je vais inviter Simon Caney à venir faire sa présentation qui va durer une cinquantaine de minutes. Et ensuite, notre collègue du département de philosophie de l'Université Concordia, Matthias Fritsch, va faire un commentaire d'une quinzaine de minutes et je vais vous présenter à ce moment-là. Donc, Simon, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for attending the lecture. I do think they fit into a sequence. The first one being what we owe to future generations, the second one thinking about how we can get from here to there. But people often say, you know, there needs to be a just transition. But I want to ask, well, who has what political responsibilities to bring it about? And I should maybe explain what I mean by political responsibility. So you might think that individuals have two kinds of responsibility: personal responsibilities, like maybe someone could eat a plant-based diet, or maybe didn't fly, or maybe they didn't drive a car, and so on. That's what I'm thinking under the heading of personal responsibilities. They're not trying to affect structural change. They might, humans should do that. But what I'm calling political responsibilities are responsibilities to change the political structure in a very broadly defined sense. So basically to affect the necessary structural change. And that might include changing laws, but also changing prevalent social norms, cultural practices, the way universities operate. So I'm trying to define political quite broadly. And I do think there's a series of questions that any account of political responsibilities has to answer. So yeah, 5. One is, if someone says people have political responsibilities, what is the content? What are the behaviours that are required? Secondly, what's the unit of analysis? Is it individuals have these? Do firms have it? Do universities have it? Do trade unions have them? You know, what are the relevant agents? And then thirdly, let's suppose you think individuals have them. Is it all individuals, or just some individuals? Is it all the university, or so on and so forth? So we need to know which particular agents. And we also need to know, who should do what. You might think individuals have political responsibilities, but what, how do we match up the content with the individual? And I think they will certainly vary depending on individuals. And then the 5th one is about burdensomeness. So often discharging these responsibilities can be consuming, demanding of resources, and in some places, environmental campaigners, get shot at and killed. So, burdensomeness can reach to the very extreme. And we can't ignore what is reasonable to ask people or demand people to do. And I'm going to put forward 6 claims. I'm going to call them grandly theses, but 6 things of which I wish to persuade you, which will collectively give you an answer to what I think are your political or my political responsibilities. That's my substantive goal. I will, at various points, say thesis 1 and so on. And I also want to persuade the philosophers amongst us of an important methodological one. So you will see in a minute that I'm quite dissatisfied with the way that philosophers have treated this, including like my earlier self. And I think one thing that was starkly absent was politics. And so you get very vague general formulations like we should change the system. And it's, I think, hopelessly inadequate. And one thing I'm trying to persuade people of is we cannot work out the content of these responsibilities without knowing, I think there's 5 kind of political facts about climate politics that emerged through the paper and the bills. Okay, so let's begin. what are the criteria by which we should judge an account of political responsibilities? I think there are four, but I think especially the first three. So one is, it would be a failure of an account of political responsibilities if people complied with them and discharged them, and it didn't actually protect people from dangerous climatic changes. So, one criterion is that it effectively realizes the goal. And that's what, suppose someone said, I think everyone has a right to a fair trial, and therefore people have responsibilities to realize it. And then you ask them, how would they do that? And they say, I don't know. I think, oh, you're not taking it seriously. These have got to be designed in such a way that they would effectively realize the goal. Criterion number one. Criterion number two is they have to be fair to the duty bearer, because as I said, the demands on the duty bearer can be quite high. You're asking potentially quite a lot of people. And Henry Shue, in his book Basic Rights, once had this metaphor of saying an account of responsibilities has to be like digging a tunnel from two ends. One is you're looking at it from the point of view of a rights bearer, and it's important that the duties protect that right, but you're also looking at it from the point of view of the duty bearer, and they've got to meet, they've got to be in some kind of equilibrium, if possible, which we will see. So that's what number two is. Number three is determinacy. Determinacy, what I mean by that is it must be sufficiently informative to guide action. And you will see in a minute what's animating that, because I think we often just get quite vague pronouncements. And then the fourth one, derivability or identifiability. We often blame people. We hold them accountable for failing to live up to responsibility. And I think that presupposes that there's a way that people can identify their responsibilities in ways that are not too demanding or impossible. So if you went to find out your responsibilities for some very obscure way, I think that's a defect in that account. Okay, so let's consider what some leading philosophers have said. Watterson, Armstrong, our political duty to get governments to do their job to prevent the disaster of excessive global warming. So for me, that fails criterion 3 about determinacy, because it doesn't give anyone any concrete guidance as to what they should actually do. And I think exactly the same point applies to John Broom's one, which is, governments should respond appropriately to climate change, and citizens should have a duty to do what you can to get them to do that. And I don't know what that requires me to do. I should say in the very first paper I wrote on climate change in 2005, I had a principle that said something like, the advantage have a duty to create just institutions. I think hopelessly vague as well. That doesn't give any content, any guiding information really. And there's two other things that are often quite common in formulations of political responsibility. So people often talk about what we. So Henry Shue, it's a great book. He's a seminal kind of contributor to these, but the subtitle you can see is why we have the moral responsibility, and there's lots of references to we and ours, but I don't know who is included under that, and also it's not clear what they have to do. And then the other thing I think often happens is people put things in the passive voice. So Nancy Fraser in Cannibal Capitalism says, doing this requires building a counter-hegemony, but there's no specificity about whose job it is to build it or how they can build it. And then it's what's needed to be done rather than who should do it. And then we have a slightly ethereal phenomenon of an eco-political sense that gets agency and affects change. And I admire her work, and I like that book a lot, but I don't think that helps answer the question. And so I have this heuristic device. And I must admit, I've engaged and met with children in the system repeatedly over 20 years, because they often say, talk, and they say it's really great, and I think it's not just about lifestyle change. I think we should engage in structural change. What do you think I should do? And I kind of didn't really have an adequate answer to that. And I think if the committed citizen looked at those formulations by these leading figures, they would say, I feel shortchanged by that. You know, is that the best that philosophers can do to tell us what our political responsibilities are? So this is an attempt to do better and to get something that is non-vague, identifiable, and reliably delivers on protecting the climate and is not unduly fairly demanding on the duty plan. Tall task, right? So let's start at the beginning. The first criterion was, I think, one criterion for an account of political responsibilities has to be that compliance with it would reliably, insofar as that's possible, get us towards a sustainable world. And then I think, well, if we're going to identify the content of this, we have to start at the end. We have to reverse engineer and think, well, what's the sustainable world look like? And then how can we get from here to there? And for that, we need a theory of political change. We need to know how do energy transitions occur? How do these kind of enormous transformations in the way societies are run occur? And if we understand that, and only, this is a strong claim, only if we understand that can we derive the content. And so let me just put flesh on those bones. So I draw here on the late Eric Olin on Realizing Real World Utopias, 2010, part 4 of that. I mean, I should say his isn't about climate change. His is about overcoming capitalism and realizing socialism. But I think no matter what your goals, even if someone had a libertarian view, like right-wing libertarian view, or even if they had some other view, I think they would agree with his checklist of the features that an account of political transformation must include. He says, so firstly, you need to know what are the forces that maintain the status quo and perpetuate the status quo. What are the political obstacles to change? Number one. Number two, what are the opportunities? What are the cracks in the system that enables change to occur? Number three is a dynamic element. So how do you think these obstacles and opportunities are likely to change over time? And then number four is, what's the repertoire of actions such that if you take these actions, they will exploit the opportunities and overcome the obstacles? And it seems to me it's almost a necessary truth that if someone wants to know how to act to affect change, they need to know these. They need to know the strategies, the kinds of actions. They need to know the option space, opportunity space, for realizing change, the opportunities. And they need to know what things are in the way so that they can bypass them or overcome them. So let me just try and summarize so far. I said we need criterion 1, effective realization of the goal. And then I said, if we're serious about that, we need to reverse engineer from there to here. And then I said, the best way to think about this is the Eric Olin Wright framework of thinking about these, this theory of change. But that's all, you know, it's quite abstract. This is where I want to just draw a little bit on some of the political science of climate politics, a tiny sliver of that, and think, well, what are the obstacles? And you might think, well, one of the kinds of obstacle are powerful actors whose interests are served by the status quo. And this is, you know, fossil fuel companies, some trade union, maybe some, but not all, energy utilities. And I've cited some of these authors and I've mentioned them earlier as well. So I think an honest account of some of the obstacles would include those actors who benefit from the status quo and are keen to preserve it. Second kind of obstacle might be institutions, and some people like, yeah, is it Jonas Meckling, I can't remember, and Nahm sort of argue that one of the obstacles is state capacity, that some states weak bureaucracies and the legislators are very dependent on donations from private actors, and therefore they find it hard to construct any autonomous laws that are not really just reflecting their powerful backers. So you might think state capacity and enables or allows state capture by private interests, and that's an obstacle. You might add other ones. Also, you might think existing cultural practices and social norms are a severe obstacle that sort of perpetuate lifestyles that make it really, that people are just really reluctant to let go of, and that's a kind of obstacle. Of course, you know, from yesterday's discussion, you might put capitalism in there as an obstacle. So I'm not trying to be comprehensive and exhaustive, I'm just trying to make it less Spartan, less abstract. Let's think about what the political opportunities. Well, there's the ballot box. There's people campaigning and voting for the green industrial policies, or a carbon tax, or keeping fossil fuels in the ground, or redesigning towns and cities. The ballot box is a source of political opportunity. There are attempts to use the law and the courts, and the Netherlands, there's a famous case, the Agenda case, a series of cases, and there's, I think, Milieu Défoncé, or Friends of the Earth, taking governments to court. There's a case in Strasbourg recently. There was a case in Switzerland. But there are cases where people take governments to court to sue them for not complying with their own commitments on climate change. And then you might think, oh, here, another opportunity might be freedom of expression and speech and protest and demonstration. That's a way of shifting policy or policy making, clearly used by lots of environmental NGOs. And then fifthly, if you're just looking global and you look at the global architecture, you might think things like the global stock take, so this phenomenon of every 4 years, there's supposed to be an assessment of how well countries have complied with their climate commitments, is an opportunity for civic bodies to come together and try and name and shame countries depending on how well they've done. So again, I think some of the political opportunities for citizens. If you think about other actors, then take a really very, very different actor like a central bank. Its political opportunities are the powers that get bestowed upon it at the central bank, and which it can arguably use, we'll come back to this, to kind of discourage investment in fossil fuel intensive industries and encourage ones in renewables. Then dynamics, I mean, obviously there are, I mean, maybe it's contentious to call these contingent events, but there are events that maybe couldn't have been predicted or foreseen, like the coronavirus, which have a big impact on the opportunities and obstacles, because on the one hand, people were tempted to invest a lot in renewables, thinking we can't depend on Russia now. On the other hand, it also led many governments to actively try and find other sources of fossil fuels. Whichever way it went, it was a variable which affected the possibility of political transformation. And what I mean by general trends is what Colgan, Green, and Hale argue, which is they think if the situation deteriorates, we have two kind of categories. We have people whose interests are jeopardized by climate change, and that group is going to grow larger. We have people whose interests are served by the economy, which causes climate change. And they say the politics of this are going to get more and more aggressive and existential as the stakes for both sides get more and more intense. So that's just something I think an account of political responsibilities has to factor in. Okay, and then someone might think, well, what are the strategies? This is very much departing from the Olin Wright script, because he has a kind of a different way of thinking about strategies. But I think this is a really good account of the types of options people would include. So sometimes there are antagonistic actions like litigating, blocking drilling. You know, it's just a full frontal attack on a fossil fuel-based economy. The second strategy is what they perhaps non-neutrally called appeasement. So compensating parties who might be harmed by an energy transition to try and get them on board. Co-optation is things where there's a body that is not particularly aligned with your goals, but you might try and persuade them to. So you might try and persuade your pension company to divest from fossil fuels, or your union to campaign for the employer to divest from fossil fuels. Others are about, for example, reinforcing the political system to make them less prone to regulatory capture. Or a fifth one is, well, supporting the enemies of fossil fuel companies, so supporting renewables companies and trying to level the playing field, or unlevel the playing field for renewable So I don't want, statements saying, oh, we should just change the system or engage in structural change. I would like something a bit more fine-grained that says, oh, look, there are some types of strategy available that I think we can easily recognize real-world versions of those. So I think we've made a bit of progress, because if someone says, what are agents' political responsibilities? I want to say, well, this is how we should think about it in the most abstract form. They should adopt strategies from that list above and use whatever the opportunities are, whether it's the electoral system, whether it's the legal system, whether it's using powers of demonstration, to take on, and we know who the constraints are, or the constraining agents. Now, for some philosophers, this is all like way too empirical. Why have you got all this social scientific stuff in here? But my answer is there is no alternative. There's no other way. We can have an a priori kind of account from the armchair, so to speak, but it won't provide any action guidance because it doesn't have a theory of change. And we won't get a theory of change unless we flesh it out in some way, like the way I've done it, but maybe with more detail and other ways of fleshing them out. So yeah, let me start with this is like the first thesis then, which is where am I? Yeah, but just to go back a bit. The only way to identify the content of people's political responsibilities is to do what I've just described. Now, that doesn't tell you what you should do or what I should do. It tells you, I think, how you should think about it. And it tells you, in a sense, what is to be done. My agents should pick strategies from the available set in the way that I described. But that gets us no further than what I said Nancy Fraser was doing, which was to say, well, what needs to be done is X. So I now want to move on to the second thing, which is to say, well, who should do it? And I want to put two claims, and the second follows from the limitation of the first. So in 2014, I published a paper in the Journal of Political Philosophy, which essentially argued, and it is a bit corny, that with power comes responsibility. And this is a more refined version of that. It's corny because I think that's what Uncle Ben says in Spider-Man. But I think there's a truth underlying that, but this is a more refined and better version of what I was trying to say then. And the thought is just those with the capability to affect this change have a responsibility, not to block this transition, but to forward it. And they have it in virtue of their power. And in a way, what it's doing is thinking about reverse engineering. It's saying what ought to be done is realizing this transition. And then it says, well, who is best placed to do this? Well, those with the capability to achieve that change have a duty to do it, because to put it in a slightly melodramatic way, you might say, look, the planet is in their hands. Suppose they don't do it, suppose they continue, some of them, to block progress, suppose they don't actively promote it, and we could continue careering towards a warming planet, then people can point their fingers at them and say, shame on you. I mean, you could have done a lot to prevent this from happening. You're part of the causal explanation. You had the power to prevent some of this from happening, and you didn't. You sat on your hands. And the only way for them to avoid that is to act in compliance with it and say, well, those with the capability to affect this kind of transition have a duty, certainly not to hinder any transition, but also positively to forward it. But I want to add, I'll explain why I add a clause. Let me say one other thing about motivating the duty. It's quite a commonly held duty in other forms. So Leslie Green in a piece on the duty to govern, I think, has a scenario where you attend somewhere, there's a crossroads, and there's clearly been some accident, and there's just chaos going to happen. But whoever gets there first, if they could just go stand in the middle and stop the traffic and guide the traffic, they could prevent this kind of chaos breaking out. And he just sort of floats the idea, well, look, in virtue of their capability there, they have a duty to take that position. And And I think the reasoning is exactly the same. If they don't do that, there'll be a terrible outcome. And people can point their finger at this person and say, look, you may not have chosen to be doing this, but just in virtue of your positionality, you have responsibilities. And I find that like a very powerful argument. But let me add the caveat. The reason why I said, as long as they have the political legitimacy to do so, is to deal with cases where someone might think there's this agent and they have the power, but they're not entitled to that power. So the example that you might use is a philanthropist, a multi-millionaire or billionaire philanthropist. And they have the power to do this. And they say, and I'm sure you can think of real life examples of people who say, I've got the power and I can bring about this clean energy transition or eradicate lots of diseases that afflict the world. And there's clearly a worry there that, I mean, I think on an account of just wealth distribution, they wouldn't be entitled to that. But even if you think that the inequalities of wealth of that magnitude, even if you grant that, I think you might think, I just think it's inappropriate that political issues be resolved by the whim or caprice of even a very well-intentioned, extremely affluent person. It should be done through the exercise of democratic power, not the discretion of philanthropy. So we can't just go from those with power have the responsibility to do it if they are not entitled to have that power. And the second clause is to think of cases where someone might be a legitimate political actor, like a central bank, but someone says, it's beyond the purview of your mandate to do this. And so, I mean, the former deputy governor of the Bank of England, Paul Tucker, who's written quite a few books on political philosophy, has he commented on climate change, not in the book, but in an interview, but he has an account of the role of central banks, which is they should stick very much to the democratic mandate, which is essentially price stability. Now, there might be controversies about this. A lot of central bankers do think it falls within their remit. I don't want to get sucked into the weeds of that issue. I just want to make the principle type of point that it's conceivable that someone might have legitimate power, but it'd be illegitimate for them to use this power in this way, because their mandate might be simply to secure some other goals. Now, of course, you might add that can be overridden, it's an emergency and so on. I just want to point out the complexities, and it's not true, contra Uncle Ben, that with great power comes great responsibility without any qualification about the sources of that power, the sources of its legitimacy. Okay, but I think this second thesis is true, but there are some really striking limitations. So many of you might have been chafing to say, look, but many of the most powerful actors are the ones most culpable of causing this problem in the first place. And so, are you naive by saying these agents have these responsibilities when, I mean, the reality is that many powerful actors are using it to thwart attempts to decarbonize the economy. And I think that does not invalidate the fact they have these responsibilities, but it does mean that we better supplement this thesis with other ones to address this. And the second kind of limitation is it says nothing about the powerless. Do they have no responsibilities? No. Next claim. And the next claim is really, suppose you are powerless, as most of us are, then I think our political responsibility is to augment power. The Ottoman philosophers have written on it. They have followed Virginia Held, who in a very influential early paper said it's a random selection of individuals and they can have a group responsibility. But the truth is, we're not talking about random groups of individuals. There are often loads of groups. There are like trade unions, there are political parties, there are social movements, human rights organizations, there's NGOs. So I don't think it's that there's a duty to like form bodies. There's often a duty to, as I call it, create counterpower or augment existing power. And this can mean a duty to empower green organizations, or it can mean a duty to green powerful institutions. So, but by green powerful institutions, I mean, join your union, or if you're already in the union, but don't play an active role, then the responsibility would be to play a more active role and steer it towards more environmental goals. So I don't think those of us who are powerless can just sort of wash our hands and say, well, we don't have political responsibilities because, and again, it's reverse engineering. I don't think an energy transition is going to occur unless ordinary individuals organize and get together to form a counter power, because many of the powerful actors are not good faith actors. So in a way, this thesis follows from the limitations, I think, of the earlier thesis, that the two should complement each other. So just to make this really less abstract, if you're a student, then on your own, you may not have much power, but you can join a student union, and that does have power. Or if you have legal expertise, then you might work for companies that defend environmental campaigners who are being prosecuted. I mean, in the UK, some of them have been handed extremely heavy penalties, years in prison for environmental protests in the last couple of months. You might work with developing countries to give them legal aid and capacity. Often negotiators from developing countries have to share policy advisors because they don't have the resources. Whereas the EU, I remember reading a book by Timmons Roberts and his co-author, is it Park? So the EU had 140 legal advisors, and this was about 10 years ago. So if you have legal expertise, you have a capability that can augment what I'm calling counterpower. And really, you can see what I'm saying about unions or pensions or just giving money to political parties. So again, I think if we're taking the goal seriously, we have to work hard to think what's required to realize it. It's what we would be finding. Now, I think that's all very well and good, but I just doubt very much that's sufficient. So I want to add in like a factual way. I mean, claim so far, but here's another factual claim, which is, it seems to me, reading a lot of the political science literature that I've been able to read on this, is that it's extraordinarily unlikely. I know of no cases where sweeping climate legislation has been adopted without there being a coalition of support. So you can be a member of your union and make it active, you can join an environmental NGO, but that will not be sufficient. What's important is that these form coalitions with others. There's a bunch of authors whose views have shaped mine there. So now some philosophers have written on this, and they say things like, oh, well, look, what we should do is identify others who are committed to climate justice and form a coalition of others. And I think that's just unlikely to be the right strategy, because it's just way too narrow. And when I've looked at cases where changes have been made, they have been through coalitions, and this goes back to isolationism and integrationism, that did not isolate climate, that did not center climate justice as the one and only thing that mattered, but they combined it with other things like land rights, so the protests against the Keystone XL pipeline, or the Dakota Access pipeline, or campaigns in California about oil refineries and people nearby suffering appalling air quality and being exposed to like a toxic environment, or campaigns in New York which brought together housing, affordability, and climate change. So I think the proper formulation of the duty to create a coalition would not say there should be a coalition between those committed to climate change, but there would be a coalition committed to the kinds of policies that would realize climate goals, which might also realize other important objectives, whether it's some people's land rights, or their concern for housing, or their concern for health. So that's the first part of that. And it seems to me very important that these coalitions be inclusive, because there have been cases where there have been groups of people committed to dealing with climate change that exclude some of the affected parties. And the policies often recommended are insensitive to their interests. And so if you get, the standard green voter in Western Europe middle class, young and educated. And I think that's also true for generally members of green organizations. I just worry that if that's the body that's going to make decisions, it's highly unlikely to be sensitive to the interests of other sectors of society. And so that's why I put a necessity of inclusion. So I'm hoping this puts more flesh on the bones. If someone says, what are my political responsibilities? I said, well, you should look what capabilities you have to affect change in organizations which can enhance their power. And in doing so, you should try and work together and build coalitions with others. It might be within a university, there's student organizations, there's faculty organizations, there are those who work in other parts of the university, and might be coalitions with local communities or local industries. But without that, it just seems like it's going to be utopian. But then, then I started to think, well, here's a really obvious fact about climate politics, and is that, if you read the philosophical ones, it says there's a child drowning at sea, and there are 5 people on the land, and none of them each on their own can do it, and then they have a duty to form a collective and do it. And one thing that doesn't appear in that description at all is they massively disagree about the goal. And I think, one clear thing about climate politics is that there's just deep divisions. So people often disagree about the goal we achieve. They disagree about the policies, whether it's carbon taxes, green industrial policy, overthrowing capitalism, carbon dioxide removal. They will disagree ideologically. They might come from very different traditions. Some people may not really be thinking of it in ideological, or they might be thinking in more practical terms, like I'm a CEO and my company's supply chains are being undermined by this. And then the others will be thinking, no, I think this is a global injustice. They disagree about the measures that should be used. So there's a nice book by Jennifer Hatton on COP in Copenhagen, saying it was just riven with disagreements about the tactics to be used, with some wanting to use sort of more conventional orthodox politics and some wanting to use more contentious type politics. And then if the coalition involves people who are not so squarely concerned with climate, but they are concerned with jobs and health and energy security, that'll just multiply the possibility of axes of disagreement. And so it seems to me that an account of political responsibilities has to take this into account. It's not like the child's drowning and everyone knows what the obvious thing to do is and they form their part, that kind of denuded of politics. And then I feel for the committed citizen who says, well, so hang on, what's my political responsibility here? Because on the one hand, I read this thing and it said like criterion 1 is effectively securing a just transition, but then, do I work with these people, which might mean compromising and diluting it, or do I refuse to work with them, refuse to cooperate, in which case nothing may be done? What should I do here? This is what I think of as the cooperative dilemma. And this is not a new problem. Like anyone who's been a student of or close engagement with socialist movements will think, oh, this is like the reform versus revolution kind of debates that people have had in the early 19th century or before that. Or anyone at my age who is familiar with like German politics will think, oh, it's like the Rielos and the Fundis who are at each other's throats. So this is not a new problem, but it is a problem, and I think an account of political responsibilities should be able to say something about how we should think here. So, do I have anything to say? I mean, I guess in all of these cases, although they're riven with conflict and disagreement, there is common ground. So you might think there's a duty to cooperate on those things that people can find common ground. Yeah. So in the UK, for example, there were proposals to extract coal from up in the northwest, and I think whatever the climate groups might disagree about internally, they can agree that's a bad thing, and they can campaign together on that, and they can agree on the attacks on climate science, and they can no doubt agree on many other things. But I don't think there's like a Venn diagram with an empty set at the middle. So they can try and see common ground. But then what about this thing about reform? So there will be cases where you might have your number one ideal, but it's unattainable. At least it's unattainable now. And there's a lot of pressure put on you to compromise. Should you compromise? And if you do, what form should it take? So I kind of think that Andre Galt had the best way I know of thinking about this that honors the two things of trying to campaign for what you think is the best possible, while not giving up on working together and cooperating with others. And the concept I'm going to use, I don't know if people are familiar with it, maybe some people are, that non-reformist reforms. Is there? Okay, I don't think many are, so let me flesh that out. What he said was there are two types of reform. There's a reform in the existing system, which makes the existing system better, but it doesn't change the system. And that's what he thought we should avoid. And then a non-reformist reform is an initiative that you can agree on now, which, and this fits in with Pablo Gilibert's work, who was here earlier. It has a dynamic quality, which is that you agree on a reform now, which has the effect of empowering agents of change and or weakening those who are maintaining the status quo. So this is my way of trying to precisify what I think the Galt means in this case. And think back to the theory of change, where I said the theory of change talks about the obstacles in front of you, the opportunities, and I think a non-reformist reform is one that makes a positive improvement to the desired goal now, but works in the future to either weaken the obstacles blocking change, so weakens fossil fuel companies, or curtails their capacity, or enhances the opportunities for change, or strengthens the political power of those agents bringing about the change. Now, sometimes people invoke non-reformist reforms and think that, of course, what would it really mean? And let me try and give you a practical example. And it comes from analyses of German politics where, and the people who are doing this are not thinking about Andre Galt, but there's this literature on positive feedbacks. And a lot of political scientists have worked at cases where you introduce the policy at T1, and it has a feedback effect. It generates benefits which create at T2 a coalition of support that is committed to maintaining this and expanding it. So I was struck that this example was given by quite a lot of political scientists. They said that the support of renewables in Germany had this feature because essentially the state provided a lot of support and it guaranteed profits to the companies providing it. I think that was just secured. And because they were guaranteed profits, they became kind of ardent supporters of this scheme. And then the benefits were shared in such a way that engendered further support. So I've got this from, I think it's Michael Lockwood, but some of those other sources I referenced there also talk about this case and also talk about policymaking in California. And I think this illustrates the kind of things that people might work towards, because what they are policies that are beneficial now, but they're not just an end now, they're a means for enabling a system change, because they're creating agents and coalitions that will push for future change. So I'm trying to make this less abstract, more real world. Of course, it depends on the empirics, so I don't know if it matches the reality of German energy politics. It's interesting to think about it with a carbon tax, because a carbon tax does not do that. What it does is immediately produce a load of people who oppose it. So yeah, if someone says, what are my political responsibilities? When I'm in a coalition with others, I'd say, you should optimize justice. And that means achieving common goals. And it might mean compromises, but it means compromises in ways that are dynamic. Don't compromise in ways that just reinforce the status quo. And so if someone says, I think we should transition to gas because it's less bad than other ones, that's a status quo reinforcing kind of initiative. Or someone says, the only thing I think we should do is have greater kind of fuel efficiency in cars. That's not going to change the system of dependence on cars. It's just going to improve it and perpetuate it and prolong it. So we'll see whether that works. I have two more kind of dilemmas I want to draw attention to. So everything so far has really looked backwards. It sort of said, well, what's the kind of world we should create? Let's work back. And I've said how we should think about the responsibilities, how we should identify them, who should have them. But I've not said anything about what's fair to ask people to do. What are the appropriate demands to make on the duty bearer? I think this leads to interesting complication. But it's a headache. There's a huge literature on what fairness to the duty bearer means and lots of different theories, and I didn't really want to go down that route. But here's a shortcut. So there are three very common views in climate ethics about the fairest ways of distributing the burden. And the three views described thus. But in practice, as almost everyone says, in practice, they converge on identifying exactly the same people. The first one looks at who caused the problem, the second looks at who's got the most wealth to cope with it, and the third looks at who benefited from the causing of the problem. So let's just take it as a rough guide. The distribution of the burdens of transitioning to a sustainable world should require more of who caused the problem and less of those who didn't cause it, or less advantaged or less beneficiary. But this has interesting implications, I think, because I think it leads to two dilemmas. So here's another obvious factual point. There has been, there is, and there will be non-compliance with these political responsibilities. So you cannot count on everyone to engage with their political responsibilities. What should a complier do? Often in the philosophical literature, people say, and I've argued, and others like Sosha Stemplosky argued, that you should sometimes pick up the slack. So if some people don't do their job, then others should do even more to make up for it. But everyone who takes that view, including myself, says there are limits, right? There are limits to that. And then that will lead to this dilemma, because suppose some people are not complying with their responsibilities. If you're really committed to achieving a just transition, then it means that those who comply should just basically supply all the necessary action. And that's going to be unfair to them. You cannot make excessive demands on them. It'll take them beyond whatever limits we accept. Or we look to the duty bearer and we say, look, there's only so much you can be expected to do, and no more than that. But that will mean that we will not secure a just transition to a sustainable world. And I just think that's an uncomfortable fact about non-compliance. Non-compliance is terrible for the potential victims of climate change. It's also terrible for the other duty bearers, because they then have to confront this. And it's nothing special about climate change. In every single possible case, there will be this kind of almost tragic situation, which is to realize just outcomes. Some people might have to make unjust sacrifices. So I think that has to be part of the account of political responsibilities, that we have to face this dilemma. And then I think there's a second dilemma, which is, as I said a moment ago, the standard criteria of just burden sharing says the burden should be borne by those who contributed most to the problem, the powerful, the rich, the wealthy. And it shouldn't be borne by the poorest people in the world who have contributed least. But I also said earlier that an effective just transition has to be inclusive of all of those affected. And that will include the poorest, the most marginalized, the most vulnerable. And so it's almost as if you think, well, to effectively realize a just transition, everyone has to be included. But if we're to be a just transition, we cannot ask very much of certain groups of people. And then I think there's just this clash between effectively realizing the transition and just distribution of burdens. So let me try and thinking of examples like things like lithium extraction or cobalt extraction in the DRC. Let's take cobalt extraction. So there's some, I mentioned it in another talk, but there's some great work by people like Benjamin Sobercool on extraction of cobalt, which is needed for batteries for electric vehicles. And the conditions there are appalling, they're dangerous, high toxicity, there's exposure to a situation which is likely to cause cardiorespiratory problems, cancer, for a pittance of pay. Now, if someone says, oh, I think all of those who are affected should take part in a coalition to effect change, does that mean that those in this situation have said, oh, look, it's really important you play a political role in this? And on the one hand, that seems like grotesquely unfair. How could they possibly have these demands put on them? But on the other hand, if they're not included, what are the odds that we'll get a policy that will treat those in that situation fairly? So that's one example. I just think you could generalize that. Let me give you another completely different example, which I don't know if it will work, and then I'll wrap up. But it's completely different. I don't know if you know the case of her name is Giselle Pellico in France. Yeah. So for those who don't know, her husband drugged her and then invited lots of men to sexually assault her while she was in the drug state and videoed it. And the case is being prosecuted in France at the moment. She has a right of legal anonymity, but she waived it. And she waived it. And what I've read is it's in the service of achieving a society where, or a world where there isn't sexual violence, where there isn't sexual assault on people. And she thought it would be more effective to waive the right of anonymity. And I was thinking about this, thinking it's kind of, there is a parallel thing here. The effective realization of justice is served by what she did there. Maybe if she'd kept anonymous, seems likely it just wouldn't have had this transformative effect on the discourse on this. But on the other hand, there's no way you could say, oh, look, you're required to do this, or it's morally justified. So I just think there's a pulling apart here between effective pursuit of justice and the just treatment of those individuals involved. And I think this is another case of not as maybe not as intense, but it's a similar problem. So I just think we have, and this is the final kind of point I want to make with political responsibilities. When we think about them, we have to confront there are these dilemmas, and there are these fairness effectiveness dilemmas where it seems maybe you can't jointly honour the two criteria of effectively realising a goal and having a fair distribution of burdens. And I think we reach a somewhat paradoxical case that justice may only be possible through unjust sacrifice. And that's true because of non-compliance. It's true because of background injustice. Okay, so I will sum up now. You've been very patient. There's 6 claims. One is that if someone wants to get the account of political responsibility, I see no option but to reverse engineer. Thesis 2 was to say, that tells us what the responsibilities are, but who has them? I said those with capabilities to bear a responsibility in virtue of that, but those who lack these capabilities have duties to augment them, to create them, because thesis 2 on its own will just not be sufficient. And then I said that that cannot be the end of the story, because it will not be sufficient to achieve a just transition. For that, there need to be coalition. Then I said, if we have these coalitions, we're going to have these kind of cooperators' dilemmas about when should you cooperate, should you not cooperate, should you remain purely true to the principles and not deviate. So then I proposed a way of thinking about that, drawing on Andre Gore. And then I said, that's not the only dilemma. You have another set of dilemmas where effectiveness and fairness seem to pull in different directions. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is, I think one reason that the existing philosophical accounts are, I think, unhelpful is they don't engage with the politics. And if you notice at each point I've brought in different factual claims about political theory of change, the necessity of coalitions, facts of disagreement, and then the last two claims again depend on contingent empirical facts. And if unless we build those in, we're going to get just very abstract formulations like we should affect structural change. And the only way to get beyond that is to put the politics back in. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Merci beaucoup. Donc, je vais maintenant inviter Mathias Frisch qui va faire un commentaire. Mathias Frisch est professeur au département de philosophie de l'Université Concordia. Ses intérêts de recherche incluent la philosophie sociale et politique, l'éthique environnementale, ainsi que la philosophie européenne des 19e et 20e siècles, notamment la théorie critique allemande et la déconstruction. Il travaille principalement sur la justice en lien avec l'histoire, le temps et l'environnement. Il s'adresse particulièrement à l'éthique environnementale et intergénérationnelle, notamment à travers des travaux philosophiques comparatifs sur la justice environnementale. Donc, thank you so much, Matthias, to have accepted our invitation.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for having me, and Simon, for these wonderful lectures. I'm wondering whether, while I was listening to you, whether my overall point will be about what you call your methodological point, using introductory remarks and then towards the end. Yeah, that point is that political philosophers shouldn't just conclude that, you know, we need to change the system and leave it at that. We need the politics. I think is a very important motivation and methodological point, and the recommendation that you made earlier that we look at the political science literature and so on. And I'm all for that, but I also find it interesting that where you end up is with various dilemmas about which you say that they have to do with background injustices, and the background injustices seem to me to call again for kind of you know, methodologically for an analysis of that system that produces those background injustices. And so you get a kind of feedback loop there that I think I would want to recommend. I think that's my overall point. I have my comments here typed up a little bit, so they got to be a little bit more precise, I think, but that's the overall agenda. So I'm in agreement that we need the most effective political responsibilities or an account of these. And some of the things that Simon said, you know, philosophers need to engage much more with the politics of it, the political conflicts, the opportunities, the obstacles, and so on. And I'm very much in favor of that. I think that one of the, you know, what we could use maybe as a motto from the written version that you have so kindly made available to us beforehand is where you say, quote, one key role of political philosophy is to guide action, end quote. And I agree, but I would want to say that, you know, coming maybe a little bit out of the Frankfurt School, that this guiding action is, should be flanked by offering diagnoses of social environmental pathologies or structural injustices on the one hand, and offering justified normative accounts in light of which we can then guide action and criticize these structural injustices. I think you do a lot on these normative accounts, not so much here in the third talk, but in the other two, and in the really wonderful work on intergenerational justice, global justice elsewhere. But here there's a real shortage of the first one, which is this analysis of, you know, systemic problem, structural injustices, and so on. But you do mention it sort of along the way, and then again, I think it comes in a little bit towards the end. So I'm going to tease this out a little bit and then say, okay, so what would be the kind of analysis, structural analysis there? So you deal with the need for a causal account of greenhouse gas emissions, but you do this only to address the question of the just distribution of responsibilities. But it seems that this causal account would also come in at the level of fairly distributing the burdens of responsibility, not just the burdens of responsibility, but the effectiveness of the change. And one way to see this, you know, while I was thinking about this, how could one make this clear is to what extent, so we can ask, does an attempt to propose concrete and effective responsibilities need to get the causal account of global heating right. So there seems to be two general ways of thinking about this. On the first scenario, there is some independence between the cause and the fix. So you don't need to worry too much about the causal story because you can go for the fix. And so this would be, for example, a fire. To put out a fire effectively and concretely, I don't necessarily need to know what started it, right? So that's scenario one. I would say scenario two is where the fire just keeps on reoccurring. Right, that would be the second scenario. And there, I do need to know why is it reoccurring. So I do need a causal account of the problem. You might, you modify this and say, there is insufficient action to actually try to put out the fire. And so you also want to have account of why is there insufficient action on putting out the fire, right? And I really like Greta Thunberg's metaphor on this in the climate book. She says it's, when the bathtub is overflowing, I don't go running for buckets, right? So this is different from putting out a fire.
What do you do?
Switching, turn off the tap. That's the first thing you do, but maybe then you have to get the buckets. And I think you would agree, you want to turn off the tap, and this is clear from your focus on mitigation, which we also discussed yesterday, adaptation, mitigation, safety, damage. So that, making sure agents do not keep on emitting the greenhouse gases. So this would suggest that climate change is more like the second scenario, the reoccurring fire. But if I see correctly, the focus in this third paper treats the problem more like the third fire. Despite the insistence on structural change. This impression comes about because of the focus on effective action, which orients us to the future rather than the past. And above all, despite the call for training structures into account, this third lecture, it feels to me on political responsibility does not, by and large, offer a causal structural diagnosis of the reasons for rising greenhouse gas emissions that may be obstacles to effective remedial action. Now, as I said, along the way, there are various suggestions of these causes, though. So major obstacles to action, for example, Simon mentions organizations that benefit from a fossil fuel-based economy, nation-state incapacity, which we've talked about, especially nation-states that are involved in competition for resources within the global market economy. And problems of institutional design. It seems to me those three you mentioned several times, especially design problems of democratic institutions that are captured by special interest in design problems that make them only short term. And I know you've written quite a bit about it. So, but it would seem to me that a more systematic account would call for an analysis of these issues in terms of structural explanation. That is, not just referring to specific causes, but referring to background conditions of structures. Right? So very speaking. So individual entities then are asked to change the relevant societal structures, but that is not also, and perhaps first of all, call for an analysis of how these societal structures shape and constrain individuals and institutions. So just flipping it around and saying, okay, there's this other side of the method that seems to be valuable here. Well, so we don't have to reopen the old, but still important debate between individualists, a la John Stuart Mill, and structuralists, a la Marx, in all its methodological and social ontological dimensions. But if we are looking for a philosophical account of individual entities' responsibilities, aiming at effective action for structural change, it would be central to examine the structures in question, including how they can train in such transformative. And if the wish for efficacy centers on climate change, the question of the result of that. So again, I don't think Simon's paper is hostile to such a structural account. He even gestures towards it on several occasions, but by and large doesn't deliver it. And so I'm just saying, okay, couldn't we also have it? So one example of a structural account may be analysis in terms of collective action problems, which we also discussed a little bit yesterday. So one common analysis suggests at the global level that nation states are caught up in a collective action problem which cannot reach agreement. I mean, that this is a very well-known analysis. Simon indicated some doubts about this yesterday. I don't know exactly the literature you were referring to there, but I'd be interested in that. But I would also wonder what you would make of Steve Gardner's well-known analysis that the collective action problem is in fact much worse in the intergenerational case, because those who stand to benefit from actually cooperating are in the future and can't in any way enforce that, so that we have a, the collective action problem indicates that we would have to make sacrifices now for the sake of future generations. So you don't actually get that. Everybody benefits from cooperating, right? So, and I mentioned that because I think it's a very convincing analysis. Suggests that the problem is moral corruption, as he puts it, but it's also that it does, at least for Steve, it suggests that what we should do is we need key things for effective action or really discharging our political responsibility. We need to take this into account, this moral corruption because of the collective action problem at the intergenerational case. And so, you know, he's working on what he calls the global constitutional convention and so on. And you may not be convinced by that, but what I'm just trying to say is that the recommendation there comes out of this. Now, here's some other considerations that seem to me to call for a structural account, and I'm going to do this relatively briefly, and none of this is news to Simon's really extensive and wonderful work on climate justice and global justice. So one is that Simon's work is especially strong in integrating global and intergenerational justice. Dominique also mentioned that. And here too, he argues that climate change is inseparable from global inequalities, but that also means that, okay, so you have you do not just need an account of, it seems to me, a normative account that integrates global justice and intergenerational justice, but you want to wonder about what is the structure that's causing both of this. Maybe there is a common structure that you might be. So that's one consideration as to why it might be important to really have this kind of structural analysis. So, as Simon also stressed yesterday, is another one in response to Eric's question. Climate change is not a single button issue. I think that's very important. It's part of a family of interconnected problems that are sometimes addressed by talking about the planetary boundaries. It also suggests that, you know, there's a bigger problem that isn't just climate change. And of course, Simon knows that. And what Simon has said in response, I think, is also very important and understandable and so on. You know, you need to start somewhere. You need an entry point into this. But it also is very important then to look at the various other issues that are connected to it, if only because treating one problem may very well cause, you know, just shift it elsewhere. So the example with the electric cars that you just discussed. So, you know, the lithium, the cobalt, and so on, generating other kinds of energy systems. So you need to look at the problem in a collective way. Otherwise, you have these externalizing displacements that you're not paying attention to. That's very important. A third reason for thinking that climate change has systemic causes: fossil fuels is deeply embedded in the infrastructure of industrialized societies. I think we probably agree on that one too. Another one is that, as I already mentioned, the problem isn't just climate change; it's also insufficient action on climate change, right? So we're not just looking at the problem now, but we're looking at the fact that action on addressing the problem has been lacking, or really has been sorely left. Annual emissions since the early 1990s have risen by more than 60%. Simon yesterday also mentioned that figure in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. The UN, in a recent report, has said that the period from 2009 to 2019 was a lost decade. So as if we had not negotiated at all. Nothing happened, despite these very expensive international conferences and so on. No result. And then, you know, sometimes it feels like in a country like Canada, perhaps especially, it's not quite right to speak of, you know, inaction on climate change. There is action, but it's funding fossil fuels massively. So I don't know whether that's the report you referred to yesterday, but you know, we talked about another UN report, the production gap report from November 2023. So just looking at what kind of investments are being made when it comes to the energy sector, and a lot of it is in fact going into fossil fuels and funded by government. So, and these have a long amortization period, and so that's why you get this problem of stranded assets if we actually could turn them into stranded assets. So then when Simon's lecture 2, this morning pointed out that we must be mindful of democratic governments being beholden to special interests which are often short-termist and economic, then this seems to me to point to a more systematic and not just an ad hoc influence. The significance of embedding of democratic institutions in a global market oriented to often short-termist capital accumulation, the dependence of states on business taxes and capital investments for job creation is the major reason for the continuing and in many places indeed increasing investments in oil and gas fields, often with the help of democratic So in response to this, it seems an account of what we should do, especially when coming from philosophers seeking to guide effective action, should analyze these deep systemic issues, which are often so. Following Eric Olin Wright's envisioning real utopias, Simon also stresses the importance of analyzing obstacles, but you don't draw on Wright's own analysis, which is, of course, as you mentioned earlier, stem from capital. The hindrances for Wright are due to the capitalist mode of production, and maybe I don't have to go into details. I'm running out of time here, but there's a systematic pressure on capitalist firms that are in competition with one another to externalize their costs, and one way in which that gets materialized is pushing the problem out to the future, externalizing the nature and the fact that it's happening. So that's also why we cannot treat climate change as a single button issue, given that capitalism asserts all of nature into the circulation of capital, stepping of planetary boundaries generally. And so that's why I would say, in conclusion, that again, Simon talks about the drivers of short-termism, and he gave us a list of that yesterday: human psychology, the open nature of the future, the vulnerability of future generation, and the features of existing political institutions, but none of them mention these capitalist drives towards short-termist profits that Eric Olin Wright discusses. So, but Simon does talk about this driver regarding institutions, which leads him to call for political responsibilities to reform the political process to prevent the capture of this process by special interests. So, and Simon has detailed this elsewhere in some of his work, so designing democratic institutions better, so to commit them to focus their policies. Yet it seems to me that these causes of short-termism include structural background conditions, including the pursuit of economic growth as an end in itself and the systematic dependence of states on capital, especially in today's situation where I would say we do not so much have domestic economies embedded in nation states, but nation states in competition with each other. So it's hard, but perhaps impossible to design institutions that are impervious to capitalist influence. But if I see correctly, Simon's principles and criteria for political responsibility, including his reform proposals for democratic institutions, don't quite do that. So my conclusion would be a call to effective action without good and systematic diagnosis of the problematic structure to be transformed, then is in danger of not being the best possible guide. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Matthias, for this wonderful comment. And I will ask Simon for a brief answer to those. And then we'll open the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much for those reading it so carefully and closely. And I think I sort of agree, but I'll explain why I look at them somewhat differently. So I was once in an exchange with Rainer for And at the end, he said, look, that's just because you were educated at Oxford and I come from Frankfurt. And I do think there are different methodological approaches to political philosophy where certain analytical philosophers will say, look, here I'm deriving these correct principles, but you asked me about the genesis of some of these problems. That's beyond the remit of the philosopher. And of course, critical theorists will say, no, that's ridiculous. You need to have a diagnosis of it and an analysis and understanding of it and do that. And I have some sympathy with the critical theorist viewpoint on this. And so here are 4 comments. In the book on short-termism, I actually have a whole chapter on the causes, but I probably would dissent from you about what they are. So I disagree with Steve, for example, on the intertemporal one. I don't think that's a major factor of climate. I think it is purely, even if there were no future generations, we would have the same kind of issues, I think. And this is where I defer, I don't want to defer is the wrong word, but this is where I'm guided much more by the way that political scientists have analysed it. So part of what I thought was actually maybe you and I just have different background explanatory theories. And yeah, and then so the second kind of thought then is, sometimes I think what I was doing was trying to give you an ecumenical account that said, it was almost methodological about how you should think about this. And so you could plug in a different explanatory account. I don't think it would affect anything about, the explanatory account wouldn't affect this point about the capacity principle, and it wouldn't undermine anything about the duty of people to form a counterpart. And I don't think it would say anything that would undermine the need for building broad-based coalitions. This is like a common staple on socialist movements. And I think, yeah, as I said, you could read Adam Przeworski's Capitalism and Social Democracy, or you can read Bernstein. You get the same kind of concerns about socialist policies being electorally popular, and either they're electorally popular, but they do dilute the socialism, or they remain pure to socialism and they lose election. So I think this is generic to any wide-scale transformational project, independently of what your causal explanatory account is. And similarly, I think this is independent of any explanatory account. So kind of response number one, I kind of think is probably true, is all of the theses remain intact, but the details of the first one will be profoundly informed by your diagnosis of the problem. So, yeah, I think that's right. But here's point number 2 then, which is, it's really hard to write a paper that says, okay, it's really hard to write a full stop. It's really hard to write a paper and say, look, I'm going to preface this with the correct diagnosis of all of these global systemic problems. I'll do that in 1,000 words, and then I will. So I don't, yeah, in a way, I just don't know how to proceed in this case. So what I thought here is I'm going to draw on the way that political scientists have analysed this problem and extrapolate from that. But of course, someone might think, I'm not persuaded by them. It's really, so people like Bellamy Foster or Kohei Saito or Paul Burkitt or all of these Marxist kind of scholars might say that's the correct account. Well, you might get Weberians saying, no, it's not class, it's also about social status. And then you might get people like Charles Tilley who combine all of these. And then I think, how can you do this in an academic paper? So I suppose what I would say is I do have an explanatory account, but it just may not be one that you think is right. But that's not getting me off the hook, because then I have to somehow motivate it, but not like a very long paper, but it's not or something. So I suppose I'm just agonizing in public about thinking about how does one develop an account here without biting off more than one can chew. And I don't know the answer to that, but I suppose what I thought was, in a way, you're making a very high demand. You're saying section 2 of a paper here has to have the correct explanatory account. So I think in a way it's not possible to realize that, because I mean Steve's whole book is an account, but lots of people don't find that persuasive. So I don't know what the right way to engage in it is. And in a way, sometimes I'm tempted by a more methodological way, which is to say, here's the framework. You plug in your explanatory account, and from my thesis, I think you can read off what you think you ought to do. But I don't do that. I oscillate between that and saying, here's my understanding of the causes of the problem, and that might be a mistake. Yeah, maybe I should stop there. So, yeah, I suppose what I want to say with point number one, you could just read my paper as a methodological one, and you could insert your theory of your diagnosis. Point number two is it's a high price to require of a paper that it have the correct diagnosis. I don't know that we could really realize that. Point number three was I do think all of the theses survive, actually. I don't think I should change any of them, but it would mean the content of the first one is deeply affected by what you're saying. And I suppose the fourth one is, yeah, I need to think much more about how to present those obstacles, constraints. Maybe I just need to acknowledge this is one way of doing it, and there might be others, and they would generate different conclusions. That's the right way. If I was writing a book on it, then I think, yeah, that's what I should do. I should do what you're doing and set out the correct diagnosis. But ambitious, no? Okay. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much. That's a lot to think about.
Okay, so now we'll open the Q&A. On va ouvrir la période de questions. Je suppose que s'il y a des questions sur le Zoom, tu me dis. Donc, okay, so I have two questions.
Okay, great. I guess I'll just start with a question would be about the international politics. I think the political emphasis is welcome. My name is Mark Burnham. I'm a professor at the École des Sciences et Gestion, the business school here, but I'm a political scientist. I think the anti-capitalist, for me, the anti-capitalist kind of critique, I think is relatively unpersuasive because we're seeing now capitalism spreading throughout the world into developing countries. So it's not, if there's a anti-capitalist critique often it seems to be like, we here in the developed world got to transition. But in growing and emerging economies especially, and what kind of implications might be the rise of BRICS and the rise of developing countries for your arguments here, because it just seems, I think there tends to be like in the ethics kind of literature, it's sort of, the positioning tends to be like, we here in the West have the power to make this change, and there's maybe some political limits to that just with the change in international political economy. And then I'll make a quick announcement. I have a book that's just, we had a book launch last night on political economy of climate finance effectiveness in developing countries. And I can circulate that just to get a little plug in.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I suppose I'm really thinking about the, I think about citizens because there's several reasons I thought about this, but one is, yeah, I give lots of public talks and people do come up and say, so, you know, what should I be doing? And just as a side, it's in the paper, but I think it's much longer than before. Then it's just the expert on social movements, I think his name is Jasper, said, he's a huge expert on it, and he said people kept coming up to him from social movements saying, what should we ought to do? What's the most effective strategies? So I'm thinking about individuals asking, and suppose global things seem so beyond their reach that that's why my focus was much more within the state and maybe much more thinking about citizens within affluent states, people I encounter most in my life. But I wonder whether once we just transpose everything I did to other contexts, in other countries, people have to think, well, what the things blocking sustainable policies, what are the opportunities for realizing it, what coalitions do we need to form, what sacrifices or compromises we might need to take. So it's the wager. My wager is the frame that should be applied back to the global arena where people are wondering, like, I don't know if the G77 is still a powerful actor or not, or thinking, well, where are we willing to compromise? Which bits are we not? What's the red line? So I'm hoping this could just be transposed to the global level and to the and to, let's say, within countries like India. One of the things in my mind was, as I think I mentioned, was Jennifer Hatton's work on Copenhagen. Why she, on her account, it's just disastrously divided between people, some of whom believe in contentious politics and more orthodox politics. Some people were much more radical about climate justice, and others were more. So it may be me, but I was kind of seeing this everywhere. Does that make sense or seem plausible, or do you think it's just very different?
Well, I think there's the historic, anyway, maybe I don't want to dominate the, if I follow up afterwards, but I think the historical responsibility, I think, resonates with a lot of developing countries, and the capacities are lower. So, but it's also just the emissions are rising most rapidly in developing countries themselves. Yeah. And so, anyway, then you have all, can we incentivize, should we be sending private finance and like fostering kind of things through transferring essentially massive amounts of resources to developing countries to help them get off emissions.
But I think the same debates will occur. There will still be, we need to form a coalition with others. There's actually disagreement. We might need to make a compromise. Well, that maybe the policy framework is a helpful way of thinking about compromises that are actually progressive. This is my hard sell. Listen.
So I have a question, you and then Romeo.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed this one. But I will try to articulate both Eric's initial remark, and so I'll call it the Marxist one, the Frankfurt School one by Matthias, in a way that might be more appealing to the Oxford-educated political philosopher. So instead of asking you whether you have the right diagnosis of reality, I'll try to turn my question into something about the form of your argument. So the way, if I follow you properly, when you discuss, and of course it's on thesis one, you argued that the strategies that we choose to exploit opportunities in order to remove obstacles must be politically legitimate. And then you listed a series of politically legitimate, what I took to be politically legitimate strategies, which were appeasement, antagonism, cooptation, institutionalism, and ultraviolence. All right? Yes. So you didn't say much about political legitimacy, so I'm reading through the list that you think that only reformist action is politically legitimate. So that, and so the objection to the argument would be, wouldn't that set unargued for constraints on the theory of change that we might choose, and on the way we identify political obstacles? So that, given that these are the only ones, then I have to, there's a kind of an a priori ruling out of a theory of change that involves war, that, for example, the example Eric gave about slavery in the States, or violent revolution. Also, it would set constraints on the way we identify obstacles, because perhaps unconsciously, it forces you to treat the problem more, to follow Matthias' analogy, as a contingent fire than as a structural fire. So, so my question was initially, isn't that an unargued, or isn't Simon assuming reformism without arguing for it? And then you have an answer for that. you say, well, there's the non-reformist reform, that I took it to be an answer to say, well, even if you're a revolutionary, there's room for you here because you can accept the idea that some reforms may cascade into change, subverting the system. But that again, and this brings you back to the 70s and the reform and revolution debate. So this is depending on an empirical fact, whether a series of reforms can cascade or not into changing a political system. And at least many people will say no, and there's a lot of evidence in the past to show that. So isn't that a problem for your argument? Even if we can argue about the diagnosis of reality or not, that you're setting an argument for constraints on the theory of change and the identification of political obstacles.
That's great. Yeah, no, makes it visible to me that I should have realized. So I've written a series of papers on there's being a global right of resistance against global injustice, like 10 years. And I never thought of those as being illegitimate. I mean, so they are, they're not breaking the law, but political legitimacy just for me is compatible with breaking the law. It's an agent that has the right to exercise power to achieve certain goals. But I certainly didn't say that or make it visible, or even probably wasn't even in my mind. It was just a background assumption that you can legitimately act in ways that are rebellions or insurrections against colonial power. So I can see why you thought this was all not changing the architecture, but I don't think it is. It's just that I wouldn't think those as being politically illegitimate. But I do think, I mean, there's probably something tacit doing the work for me, which is I'm just skeptical about things like violent revolution and these things of being effective. And in that, I'm joined by Eric Olin Wright, who in part 4, he talks about these 3 strategies. I can't remember the names, but one is interstitial, where you're kind of working within the gaps to bring change, and others are like a full frontal attack. And I think, I can't remember, it's the third one, which I think he's particularly keen on, which is essentially, like anarchists say, trying to make the new grow out of the old. And that's what he favoured. So I think he was just sceptical about any full frontal direct assault on capitalism. Now, I suppose when I think about what needs to be done, I think we need things like investing in sustainable infrastructure and long-term energy sources. And when I would read about protests and people I admire hugely, like I forgot his name, but Andreas Malm, I think I don't actually think that's a plausible theory of political change. I think what he calls for, I'm not sure that will lead to the kinds of changes. So none of this is visible in this. It's all like subterranean, but I suppose implicitly that's what I'm assuming. I'm assuming some of these more radical ones won't be effective at achieving the certain kinds of goals. But in a way, it illustrates, I think, one of your core points, which was, you think I need a diagnosis of the problem. I agree. We also need a theory of change that builds on that. And I have some tacit assumptions that are informing the way that I talk about it, but really not visible. So it's not that I think it's illegitimate necessarily. I just think I can't see that this is a plausible trajectory for these changes.
But wouldn't you need to expand the list?
Yeah. Well, would you? I mean, confrontational strategies is a very capacious category. You could be right that I would need to expand. But yeah, antagonism is not quite a big that could include.
It's like changing the political system. You need more determinacy, I guess.
I mean, I said reforming the legal, but I could just say changing or creating. And it could be, it could be radical, right? It could be a new society that completely prevents corporate power from exercising any political power.
Maybe if you write revolution, that would be more clear.
From a paper to a very fat book.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the tension is either you have principled argument for ruling out some kind of theories of change.
Yeah.
or you need to have an open-ended list of strategies in the argument. I mean, there's no escape to that.
So we have a question from Romeo.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful talks. I have a question about antagonism and more broadly about strategy. You mentioned in the UK how the state repression towards environmental activists is quite severe. I think it's generalizable across many countries. The legal penalties, the category of terrorism that's been expanded is very worrying and is, I think, a big obstacle for coalition building or for even envisioning strategies like as engaged citizens, let's say, or political actors for movement. But I think your framework can accommodate this. I would have a question more about other obstacles that are not so obvious as state repression. It's related maybe to the intervention of Matthias Fritsch about if you plug in socialist theory, causal theory of why there is such a poor response to global climate change. I think if you take like the socialist neo-republicans do, that market dependency is a major constraint on agents' capacities. And if you take that to be a feature, a structural feature of inequality or the political economic system, I think then it does affect the other thesis. If you plug in this in the first thesis, and you take it as a major constraint on individuals' freedom and capacities. And this is a bigger problem, I think, or more complex problem than just state repression, which I think we can address. But if you take more systemic constraints that are placed on agents due to labor market dependency or more generalized market dependency, I think maybe it's a bit harder. I wonder if you see it as an obstacle, this labor market dependency or just market dependency in general to the formation of a counterpower or coalition building, because workers and people who are exploited by the labor market, who are constrained by the labor market in a major way, have more difficulty cooperating, organizing, and face burdens than, let's say, firms or capitalists or firm. Yeah, I was wondering if in your framework, is this a problem, or how could you accommodate it, or is it not that big of a problem? I was just wondering.
No, that's an excellent question. And I have thought about something related to that, but actually different, about constraints of political organizing. So it's very fragmented. If they unions and everyone is in a position of dependence, it might be very hard to create counterpower. Union membership goes down. Yeah, this makes me all very pessimistic, I must admit, because the two things, I mean, yesterday Eric asked about basically could capitalism cope with climate change. One of my points was I just thought any system would really struggle with it because we just got way too many fossil fuels and people like energy. But maybe the particular problems under capitalism, that's quite compatible. But one of the replies is, well, what if the state or people could engage in political action? And then what you're pointing out is that that might be hard to engage politically. Another thing that might be hard is people's lives are just very busy. It's not just that they're dependent, but they're having to work long hours and they're exhausted at the end of the day. And the idea of saying, oh, look, you should engage in political action is a big ask. And there's a book by, I suddenly forgot his surname, Kevin something, who's on busyness and democracy, and how radical Democrats are always saying, oh no, people need to participate more, and how absolutely unrealistic that is. And so it was about how to make democratic participation less demanding and so more realistic. And I would put what you put as a sort of similar thing that worries me, or similar to the thing that worries me, which is it's all very well saying we need political action, but people are working hard and long hours and they're exhausted at the end of the day, and so the conditions might be such that it's inimical or really hostile to the political action that's needed. So that's how I would think about it. I think it's plausible, but isn't it another cause of pessimism, maybe? You think?
Well, I think it might motivate, like you say, your approach is economical, or like climate justice cannot be addressed, or the problem of climate change cannot be addressed without. And now I rejoin the socialist and the critical theorist, or some social democrats and radical liberals who also adhere to the social democracy on Republican basis.
Yeah. Oh no, the attractiveness of the thing is reinforced, but it also the difficulties in achieving it, I think, are harder.
Thank you so much. Now we have a question by Guillen.
Well, a somewhat peculiar question. So if you don't want to answer it, you don't. That's okay. That's fine with me. So climate change as a topic in philosophy has become a topic. I mean, and you've been a key player in circumscribing the field. But then you've got other people in the philosophical field who are now trying to occupy the field. And we're talking about political responsibilities, but maybe we should talk about philosophical responsibilities, because you had your theoretical contribution, but you were also engaged in a practical way with different councils and in advisory, capacities. But then you've got people in Oxford like William MacAskill and Toby Hall, who are, I mean, some of you know them. They are not exactly playing the same game. I mean, theoretically, that's very different. They've got a very vast and comprehensive approach of the responsibilities of philosophy. I mean, they list the job that you should enter to contribute to the future of the world. They have, consideration for the future generation. They tell you how to spend your money. So what do you make of them?
There's lots of things to say, but one thing was they were kind of on they were kind of on my mind in this, which is, so I've worked a long time on things like global poverty as well and global inequalities, and it was always the same. People would say, do you think people should give money? And they can, Peter Singer thinks that, but we think what's needed is radical structural change. Let's go and have a drink and go to the bar, and that's the level of analysis. I got really frustrated. I look at the effective altruists and they say, we can tell you exactly what you should do. And I think people fault them in many ways, especially the confidence with which they come out with these concrete descriptions. But I do think they were right to be able to answer what I'm calling the committed citizen, who says, I think I should give money to whom I should give it. So I'm talking about politics, and they tend to studiously ignore politics. Yeah. But I think they are right. I think they're responding to a question that people want to know, well, what should I do? And I applaud them for trying to come up with a precise answer that's informative, even if I disagree with their methodology and their assumptions.
It's a job of a professor of philosophy to...
Well, I'm gonna quote someone, and Matthias may know who I'm going to quote.
Tu devines, Matthias?
Is it Crowley?
It's
either Elon Musk or Sam Bankman-Fried.
You're mischievous. No, it's Aristotle. So
The billionaire.
Back to classics.
Yes, Aristotle says we should, it's early on in the Nicomachean Ethics, we should aim for the level of precision and exactness that the subject matter permits or allows. And so when I talk about determinacy, it's got to be read in that way. So, and I just think saying, oh, look, you should do the right thing to change your government's policy fails that. So yeah, I was thinking of appealing to the authority of Aristotle and saying that I do think, I think there's two kinds of philosophy, which I'm just going to speak ex cathedra. One is the kind practiced by my doctoral supervisor, Jerry Cohen, and I just wanted to identify what we should think, what is true. And that gets undervalued, and people often poo-poo it and say, no, I just want to know what we should do. But I think he's absolutely right. But I do think it should be able to inform our actions and guide human conduct. So here I'm thinking that mode and thinking, and I am really troubled because there are loads of committed citizens out there, and I think they're owed an answer. And so this is an attempt. It's an 18,000 word attempt with this is a even longer account to try and answer a really good question that they often ask, which is, what do you think I should do? Have you got any advice?
We have I have a question from Christophe Malatin.
Yeah, since I'm not chairing, I can ask the question. And so at one point in time, you said that capabilities goes with responsibility, and then towards the end, we also had a duty to increase our capabilities.
Yeah.
But then I was also wondering, and you often talk about the agents as being the informed or the committed citizen.
Yeah.
But in some of the things that you mentioned in the first part of the talk, and in particular also earlier this morning, you identified different types of agents, causal agents to the problem here. And so I was sort of wondering, I mean, sometimes are we only talking about the committed citizen as an agent, or are we talking about the entire spectrum of agents? If we're talking about the entire spectrum of agents, then I guess the capabilities are maybe very diverse.
Yeah.
Some of the opportunities that they may have for some agents are not opportunities at all for others. For instance, trade unions do not vote in federal elections, and only individual citizens vote. Right. So on the other hand, if one of the conclusions that you draw is that those who do not have the capabilities should try to have a duty to increase their capabilities. If this also applies to all the different agents, then it may be an argument that goes against your argument that legitimate actions of some agents, like you said, that central bank does not, it will be illegitimate for a central bank to take certain type of action. But if the central bank is an agent, and it has the duty, it doesn't have the capability initially, but it has a duty to increase its capability. Maybe it can find somehow some wordings in its legal status that enables it to somehow twist its capabilities in such a way that will increase its capabilities and then be able to be an agent of change in a stake.
Good, excellent. So it was supposed to be for all agents, but then I just zeroed in on individuals. But the individuals could be the head of a union or the head of a church or a CEO. But then it is important to ask, as you do, are all the theses applicable for other kinds of agents like central banks? And to be honest, I haven't thought that through, but my wager is yes. So you might think, so I really I'm not an expert on central banks, just to get that out there. But you might think the European Central Bank and the Fed and other central banks might agree and try and hammer out a consistent policy, because maybe there will be pathologies if there's not a uniform response and people will forum shop. So it's conceivable. I think they're very powerful agents as it is, but so I'm not sure they would have my third thesis duty to augment power. But you might think, they have a duty to form coalitions, and so in principle possible, But I was really zeroing in on and I should make that clear. And maybe there's more than one. Maybe I think about cases with other entities, and they might, the theses might be permutations there, variations. That's true. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll start from an observation about the conversation you had with the commentator, Professor Fish. So I thought the difference between the explanatory theory that you relied on was that when you said that, it is because of the states captured by corporations, because they do an important job of producing jobs. So they had to be kind of curried favor with to kind of produce that goal of economic growth. And on the other hand, you said, well, there are governments who win elections by putting forward environmentally friendly policies. I thought there was kind of a divide between the more agential explanation and the structural explanation. And those cases does not necessarily negate the structural explanations, I think, because there may be cases where governments fail to win elections because of that. And I wondered more broadly, because we can make different explanations, empirical explanations or diagnosis, and we'll have disagreements at that level. What would it mean for how to concentrate our resources and efforts to go forward, or does it matter for how to think about our responsibilities moving forward?
So can you say the last bit? So I think you're saying I was giving a more agential explanation and Matthias giving a more structural explanation.
So
and
if our explanations differ about what are the causes of the problem and probably having implications about what we should work on, then how do we move forward?
That's what worries me, you see. That's what, because then we have to say, oh, that's actually too much stuff for one correct theory. So I think there's two strategies here that you often get in political philosophy. Someone says, this is a controversial one. I'm going to proceed to some view that everyone can accept. And I think partly sometimes I was doing that a bit. I was saying that the way to think about it is to think, what are the obstacles? What are the opportunities? You can plug in your own explanatory theory, but whatever, the only way you're going to get these political obligations or responsibilities is by practicing this. So it's like it gives you the formal structure and then you put it in. But I didn't really just do that. I have my own explanation, which is less tied to things like capitalism and less structural. It's more eclectic, let's say, or ill thought out. You can use your adjectives. So that's how I see. I see nothing stopping me. I don't think global capitalism would prevent the UK from decarbonising its economy. I think or the US. So that's. I think it's the grip of certain fossil fuel companies who have a lot to lose from this. So it's a typical Mancur-Olson type explanation. There's diffuse benefits and there's centralized benefits. And when you've got a small number of powerful actors who would be profoundly affected, they have power. And when you've got a load of others who are beneficiaries and they're diffuse, then the status quo is going to preserve and perpetuate. So yeah, I imagined myself as a sort of Mancur-Olson type of. Yeah, I think so one response then is just to say, here's the architecture of how you derive responsibilities, plug in your voluntary account, and it will yield the answers. But the second way is to say, follow my empirically sourced one, drawing on literature on climate politics and what I've learned from them, and say, that's the right way I think you should derive it. And then the third way is maybe Matthias, which says, no, I think it's a better explanatory account that's more systemic, that more ties it into global capitalism. So those, I think, are the three roads. Does that make sense to you? I know I was meandering a bit.
So do we let three roads all be systemic by how much they're persuaded?
No, but this gets to something I do touch in the paper, which is to do with disagreement. So I think with this engineering is the way we have to do it. But there's something, and I talk about this a bit in the paper. It's not as easy as it looks, because you say you have to reverse engineer from how things are to how they ought to be. But people will have different accounts of how things ought to be. So some people might say, let's take the Biden administration. Some people might say, oh, I think that's great, the green industrial policy. And then others think, no, that's outrageous, because what it's doing is de-risking these assets, which are owned by private corporations, and that's not the end state. So this presupposes an end state. And later on, I talk about how you deal with disagreement when I say when you should compromise and when you shouldn't. And maybe that's the right way to think about the goals. And you have to think, well, from your own point of view, what is the ideal to be aimed for? And then when are you willing to compromise and when are you not? And I've given advice about that. So the advice being, well, find common ground with others who share enough of your common goals and only compromise in ways that further advance So I wonder whether what I would end up with is kind of a pluralistic vision where people might apply this and come up with different recommendations to themselves because they have different understandings of the nature of the goal to be aimed for. It's turning into a book, but I'm not. No.
I just have a small question, and then I think Christophe, and then we'll close. My question is that, and going back to Matthias's intervention, I was wondering if one of the problems with this kind of explanation that I find convincing in many ways is the consequences in terms of motivations. So if you tell people, well, it's all about, those are the structural factors that explain the situation we are in, and we're back into, saying that the problem is global capitalism, then in a sense you make the motivation to act the committed citizen less plausible. No, my sentence doesn't make sense. You make it more difficult to motivate the individual citizen, because it's going to say, if it's global capitalism, well, I might as well go back to bed. And so I wonder if part of your strategy, since you are addressing the committed citizen, is to try to draw, because I had the feeling often in your eclecticism, with the way to tell people there's lots of things that you could do. Yeah. We don't know if that's going to be enough. I'm afraid it won't be enough, actually. But at least you'll be doing something, and we can't be worse off. Is there something like that going on in the paper?
Well, what I think is there is, and I do make it explicit earlier on, I think there's a commitment to an ecumenical approach. When specifying reverse engineering, you have to think what's sustainable and what's just. And then I talk a little bit about the literature on climate justice. And I say, one way of doing it is to say, I have to hammer out the correct theory of climate justice. And then everyone else has to agree with it. And that's the goal. And then we'll march towards that. I say, no, that's not plausible, because there's reasonable disagreement about that. And it's fortunately the case that all the rival accounts roughly point their finger in the same direction. But I have a similar mental attitude to explanatory disagreements. If I said, we've got to work out the one true explanation of why it occurs, then loads of people I know who are committed to tackling climate change will say, well, I'm not on board, because I've got climate friends who say, if it means the end of capitalism, I'm getting off the bus. It endorse capitalism. And so then I think there's a kind of ecumenical reason for trying to get as far as you can without having to resolve. It's a very Rawlsian kind of thing. We're trying to resolve these big cases. If we say, well, let's find the correct account of climate justice and the correct explanation, then I don't think you're going to get big participation, because people will just not agree with it.
Just very short word. Yeah. Just none of what I said implies that you first have to overcome capitalism, then you can deal with climate change. And I think that Simon is exactly right, that these other theses there, they all still stand, right? Yeah. It's just a question. He says we have to identify the obstacles. Yeah. Saying one of the obstacles is these massive capital interests. And if you want to fight them, you have to have an account of why they are so powerful. If you want to extend democracy, you have to know that one of the things you have to do with respect to democracy is to make sure that you can really combat all these influences and stem it. So, for example, energy democracy might very well mean we have to remove all of the energy infrastructure from private investment. We have to bring it under democratic control. So it tells you what you want to go for when you have the structural analysis. That's what I wanted to say.
Yes, so that clarifies. We have one
more question.
One more question, but short.
It's just a remark, like, as a sociologist, it's also saying, like, the question of at what scale do you operate also depends on the institutional arrangement that has been done in the past where you are. So, for example, if we're talking about energy democracy, here the more logical way to tackle it would be to be at the provincial level, because historically that's how it's been arranged. So it makes no sense to talk about energy democracy at the level of a city here, because the energy is provincial. So that it gives you a lot of implication about how to act. And also, it doesn't mean that because you want to tackle it as a municipal level that you won't have an obstacle of you know, globalized investing funds, for example. So it's not because you act locally that those obstacles, you won't be able to face it as a very micro local level as well. So they work together. It's not because you say it's a global problem that you won't be able to fight like a mining company at a very local level as well. So.
Okay, so I think it's time to thank our speaker. Matthias Frisch, who did a great job. And I would thank all of you who have stayed till the end. I want to give my last thanks to the people who made this possible. I won't name the list of the sponsors, but I'd like to thank the Department of Philosophy and Vincent Guillen, who has been a great support throughout the full experience. And I would have liked to thank Romeo Ménard-Baudin, because he's the student who has helped us setting up stuff, but I guess he's doing it right now, so we will transmit him my thanks. And let's also thank the personnel du département, Amélie Desbiens and Emilienne Cadon. Voilà. Hélène from the CIRST, who has been of great assistance. Merci à tous et nous avons...
The department thanks Dominique and Christophe for organizing. It was wonderful.
And we have a few drinks, non-alcoholic, I hasten to add, for everyone in the Espace Philo. Thank you.
Thank you.